Peter Miller was 11 years old when, huddled inside a passenger car buried deep in the Appalachian forest of Hinton, West Virginia, he lit an old kerosene lantern and opened a leather briefcase that had not seen the light of day since 1952. The flickering light danced across the dusty interior, revealing the contents within: a stack of yellowed papers, and on top, a single sealed envelope. With trembling fingers, he opened the letter and began to read the words written from a railroad man to his young son. As the meaning of the message settled upon him, a profound and silent cry escaped his lips, his small shoulders shaking in the cold, still air. It was not a cry of sadness for his own difficult life, but one born from the sudden, overwhelming, and painful understanding of a parental love so pure and deep that he had never known it could even exist. This kind of story, a single moment that redefines an entire life, connects with us all in different ways, reminding us of the unexpected discoveries that can change our path. Before we uncover the journey that led Peter to this life-altering revelation, I would love to know where you're listening from today. Please take a moment to let me know in the comments section below. If this story has already captured your attention and you feel a connection to Peter's journey, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows us to continue sharing these powerful narratives, and we are grateful for every person who joins our community of listeners, becoming a part of these stories with us. Your engagement truly makes a difference. To truly comprehend why a forgotten refuge and a 70-year-old letter became the catalyst for Peter's liberation, we must go back in time. This moment of profound emotion was not the beginning of his journey, but rather the destination of a desperate and silent escape. We need to return to 4 days earlier, to a bleak Friday afternoon when the illusion of his life was shattered. It was there, surrounded by the smell of oil and the cold metal of an auto repair shop, that he discovered his life was being sold by the one person his parents had trusted to protect him. He was not a godson to be cared for, but an asset to be liquidated for the price of $400 a month, a transaction that would force him to run. Peter Miller was a boy shaped by silence and absence. At 11 years old, he had already lived 2 distinct lives. The one before the accident, filled with the low hum of train yards and the warm scent of his father's work coat, and the one after, which was defined by the cold dampness of a basement and the sharp smell of motor oil. For the past 2 years, since a railroad derailment had claimed both of his parents, he had resided in Hinton, West Virginia, under the guardianship of his godfather, Robert Davis. This arrangement, presented to the world as an act of compassion, was a carefully constructed lie. Peter was not a foster son. He was an unpaid servant, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was not his own, his existence measured in the chores he completed and the small space he was allowed to occupy. His world had shrunk to the 4 concrete walls of his room and the greasy floor of an auto repair shop. His living quarters were in the basement of Robert and Susan Davis's small house, a space that was more of a cellar than a bedroom. A single bare bulb hung from a wire, casting long shadows over the concrete floor that was perpetually cold, even in the summer. His bed was a simple military-style cot with a thin, lumpy mattress and a single threadbare blanket that offered little comfort against the subterranean chill. There were no posters on the walls, no toys on the floor, no books on a shelf. His only possessions were kept in a worn-out backpack tucked under the cot, 3 faded photographs of his parents, his father's old Chesapeake and Ohio railway cap, and a change of clothes. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and neglect, a constant reminder that he was an afterthought, an unwelcome obligation hidden away from sight. Each day began before sunrise, at precisely 5:30 in the morning, when the boiler in the basement would clank to life, serving as his unfeeling alarm clock. His first tasks were for Susan. He had to take out the trash, sweep the kitchen floor, and wipe down the counters before she even came downstairs. Only after these chores were completed was he allowed a meager breakfast, usually a single piece of dry toast and a small glass of milk, eaten standing up at the kitchen counter. There was no conversation, no morning greeting, just the silent, transactional nature of his existence. He was a component in the household machinery, a part that was expected to function without complaint or need for maintenance. His hunger was a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, a feeling he had learned to ignore. Robert Davis was a man whose presence filled a room not with warmth, but with a heavy, oppressive stillness. He rarely spoke to Peter directly, preferring to issue commands through his wife or with a pointed gesture. His face seemed permanently fixed in a state of mild irritation, as if Peter's very existence was an inconvenience he was forced to endure. Robert owned a small, struggling auto repair shop on the edge of town, a place of loud noises and the pervasive scent of gasoline. It was here that the second half of Peter's workday unfolded. He was not just a godson living under Robert's roof. He was an asset, a source of free labor that allowed Robert to cut costs and pocket what little profit the garage generated. The man his parents had trusted with his future saw him only in terms of his utility. From the moment school let out until well after dark, Peter toiled in the garage. His small hands, stained with grease that never fully washed away, were put to work on tasks no 11-year-old should have been performing. He would spend hours scrubbing engine parts in chemical solvents that made his eyes water, washing customers' cars in the biting West Virginia cold, and sweeping the vast, oil-stained concrete floor. Robert would watch him from his small office, his eyes narrowed, ensuring the boy never paused for too long. There was no praise for a job well done, only a gruff nod or a sharp command to move on to the next task. The garage was a world of harsh sounds and hard surfaces, a place where Peter learned that his worth was measured solely by his ability to work without complaint. Susan Davis, Robert's wife, was a different kind of warden. Where Robert's cruelty was active and demanding, Susan's was passive and dismissive. She never raised her voice, but her silence was a weapon. She treated Peter with a chilling indifference, as if he were a piece of furniture she was forced to dust around. She was the gatekeeper of the house, ensuring he kept to his designated spaces, and never felt truly at home. It was Susan who doled out his small portions of food, who inspected his chores with a critical eye, and who reminded him, through sighs and exasperated looks, of the burden he represented. Her complicity was the foundation upon which Robert's exploitation was built, creating a united front of neglect that left Peter with no one to turn to and nowhere to feel safe. The deepest betrayal, however, was one Peter did not yet fully understand, though he felt its consequences every single day. His parents, both lifelong railroad workers, had left behind a substantial survivor's pension administered by the Railroad Retirement Board. This fund was specifically intended to provide for his care, his education, and his future, ensuring he would have every opportunity despite their absence. It was a final act of parental love, a financial safety net designed to protect him. Robert, as his legal guardian, had been given full control of these monthly payments. The money that was meant to be Peter's salvation had instead become the fuel for his enslavement, a secret stream of income that his guardians had diverted entirely for their own use. While Peter wore second-hand clothes and went to bed hungry, the Davis household saw subtle but significant improvements. There was a new, larger television in the living room, a room Peter was not allowed to enter. They began eating out at a local diner once a week, a luxury they had never afforded before. Susan bought new clothes and Robert started smoking a more expensive brand of cigarettes. These were small changes, but they were paid for with the money that should have been buying Peter new shoes, funding a college savings account, or simply providing him with a warm meal. The irony was devastating. The legacy of his parents' hard work was being used to finance the very people who were systematically erasing any hope for his future, turning their love into a source of personal gain. Internally, Peter had adapted to his circumstances with the quiet resilience of a child who knows no other reality. The constant ache in his stomach and the weariness in his bones had become his new normal. He had forgotten what it felt like to be truly full or properly rested. He didn't question why he lived in the basement or why he had to work so hard, because there was no one to ask. He simply accepted it as his lot in life. This normalization of suffering was perhaps the most insidious aspect of his captivity. He had started to believe, in some small, unspoken part of himself, that this was what he deserved. The vibrant, curious boy his parents had known was being buried under layers of exhaustion, loneliness, and a profound, unshakable sense of worthlessness. His only escape was into the small world contained within his backpack. At night, in the dim light of the basement, He would pull out the 3 photographs of his parents. In one, they were all smiling on a train platform, his father holding him up on his shoulders. He would trace their faces with his finger, trying to remember the sound of their laughter, the feeling of their arms around him. He would put on his father's Chesapeake and Ohio Railway cap, the worn fabric still holding a faint scent he associated with safety and love. These objects were more than mementos. They were proof. They were evidence that a different life, a better life, had once existed. They were a fragile shield against the crushing belief that he had always been, and would always be, completely and utterly alone. In the week leading up to his discovery, a new tension had entered the house. Robert began making quiet phone calls late at night, his voice a low murmur that Peter could barely hear through the floorboards. He saw Robert meeting with a man he didn't recognize, a stranger with a large truck who came by the shop after closing time. They would talk in hushed tones, occasionally glancing over at Peter as he finished his work. The boy didn't understand the significance of these meetings, but he felt a shift in the atmosphere. Robert's usual irritation was now tinged with something else, a kind of nervous energy, a sense of anticipation. A cold knot of dread began to form in Peter's stomach, a primal instinct telling him that the fragile, painful stability of his life was about to shatter. He was trapped, and he knew it. The people of Hinton saw Robert Davis as a stand-up man who had selflessly taken in his orphaned godson. Teachers at his school, seeing his quiet demeanor and tired eyes, simply assumed he was still grieving. There were no outside systems of support checking on his well-being, no concerned relatives to notice the changes in him. His prison was invisible to the outside world, constructed from social perception and legal guardianship. He was completely isolated within his suffering, a silent victim of a crime no one else could see. The understanding was slowly dawning on him that if he was going to be saved, he would have to save himself. His world was shrinking, and the walls were closing in, making the idea of escape not a choice but a necessity for survival. The definitive threat, the one that would sever the last frayed thread of his childhood, did not arrive with a shout or a strike, but on a piece of crumpled paper. It was late Friday afternoon, and Peter was sweeping the grimy floor of the auto repair shop, his movements slow and methodical from exhaustion. Near the leg of Robert's cluttered desk, his broom pushed against a wadded-up ball of notebook paper. It was likely just a discarded calculation, or a parts list, but something about its placement, kicked carelessly into a corner, made him pause. Instead of sweeping it into the dustpan, he stooped down, his small hand closing around the fragile paper. He felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a premonition that the contents of this forgotten note held a significance far greater than its disposable appearance suggested, a secret not meant for his eyes. He slipped the paper into his pocket, his heart beginning to beat a little faster, and waited until Robert was occupied with a customer to retreat to the dark corner behind a stack of old tires. With trembling fingers, he carefully unfolded the page. The paper was thin and cheap, and the words were scrawled in Robert's familiar, jagged handwriting. It was not a parts list. It was a crude, handwritten agreement. The first words he deciphered made the air in his lungs turn to ice. His own name, Peter Miller. He read the line again and then a third time, struggling to comprehend the cold, transactional language that was being used to describe him. It was a contract, simple and brutal, an informal bill of sale for a human life, and the life being sold was his. The world around him seemed to narrow to the horrifying words written on that page. The document outlined a deal between Robert Davis and another man, the owner of a trucking company based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The key phrase, repeated twice, was the transfer of temporary guardianship. Peter did not know what all the words meant, but he understood the intent. He was being given away, handed over from one master to another. The agreement stipulated that in exchange for this transfer, Peter would be required to work. The location was explicit, a large warehouse facility owned by the trucking company. His purpose was no longer to be a ward or a godson, but a laborer. The document stripped away any pretense of care or family, reframing his existence as a simple asset to be moved from one place of exploitation to another, his future decided by 2 men in a greasy auto shop. The most sickening detail was the price. The contract clearly stated that Robert Davis would receive a monthly payment of $400, paid directly to him, for as long as Peter remained in the custody of the trucking company. $400. That was his value. The cost of his freedom, his childhood, and any chance of a future was a sum that would barely cover the rent on a small apartment. He finally understood the stolen pension, the meager meals, the endless work. It was all part of a larger calculation of his monetary worth. He was not a burden to be tolerated, but a resource to be squeezed dry. And now that his utility in Hinton was reaching its limit, he was being liquidated for a final recurring profit. He was an annuity, a stream of income secured by his own servitude. The implications of the destination settled in his mind with crushing weight. Pittsburgh was a big city, hours away by car. He had seen it on maps in his school library, a sprawling network of roads and bridges, a world away from the small familiar confines of Hinton. Once there, he would be completely anonymous, a nameless child laborer in a vast industrial warehouse. There would be no teachers to notice his exhaustion, no neighbors to wonder about the boy who never played outside. He would be invisible, swallowed by a city where no one knew his name or his story. The plan was terrifyingly perfect in its cruelty, designed not just to exploit him, but to erase him completely, ensuring he could never find his way back and never tell anyone what had been done to him. The most terrifying part of the contract was its immediacy. The transfer was not some distant, abstract threat. It was scheduled. At the bottom of the page, in the same hurried script, was the deadline: this coming Monday at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. A specific time and a specific place were also noted. Robert was to bring him to the Hinton bus terminal. The ticking clock started in his head, each second that passed bringing him closer to that appointed hour. He had today, Saturday, and Sunday. Less than 72 hours before his life would be irrevocably altered. The knowledge was paralyzing. The threat was no longer a vague feeling of dread, but a concrete appointment on a calendar, a final destination from which there would be no return trip. The bus terminal, a place of goodbyes, would be the site of his final disappearance. In that single devastating moment, the entire structure of his life collapsed. The man his parents had trusted, the person they had named as his protector in their will, was not just neglecting him. He was actively and deliberately trafficking him. Every act of supposed kindness, every roof over his head, every meager plate of food had been a lie, a performance to maintain the illusion of guardianship, while this final betrayal was being orchestrated. The cold indifference from Susan, the constant demands from Robert, it all made a new horrifying kind of sense. He was never their godson. He was their property, an inheritance they had decided to cash in. The depth of this deception was a wound far deeper than any physical hardship he had endured. There was no one he could turn to for help. The realization was as clear and cold as the concrete floor beneath his feet. If he went to his teachers, they would call Robert his legal guardian. If he went to the police, what proof did he have? A crumpled piece of paper that Robert could easily deny writing. He imagined the scene. Robert, appearing concerned and compassionate, explaining that Peter was a troubled boy still grieving, prone to making up stories. The world saw Robert Davis as a respectable small business owner who had taken in his orphaned godson. Who would believe an 11-year-old boy over him? Any attempt to expose the truth would be twisted, used against him, and would likely only hasten his departure to Pittsburgh. He was completely and utterly on his own. The crumpled contract in his hand felt like a physical weight, the tangible proof that his life in Hinton was over. He could not go back to the house, could not sleep in the basement, could not look Robert or Susan in the eye knowing what they planned for him. To stay was to surrender, to walk willingly to the bus station on Monday afternoon and allow himself to be sold. The fear was immense, a suffocating pressure in his chest, but beneath it, something else was taking root, a cold, hard resolve. The question was no longer whether he could endure this life, but whether he could escape it. The choice had been made for him. He had to run. The only alternative was to disappear into the system they had created for him, and that was a fate he could not accept. Back in the workshop, the crumpled paper felt like a burning coal in his pocket. The loud clang of a falling wrench jolted Peter from his trance, but the world around him had fundamentally changed. The familiar smells of oil and metal were now the smells of a cage, and Robert's gruff voice was the sound of his jailer. The shock that had frozen him began to melt away, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. There was no room for tears or for panic. There was only the stark, undeniable truth of the contract and the ticking clock it represented. In that moment, a quiet but unbreakable decision formed in the deepest part of his being. He would not be at the bus terminal on Monday afternoon. He would not be sold for $400 a month. He would run. The decision was not an act of bravery, but one of pure, instinctual survival. It was the only choice left. He forced his body to move, to continue sweeping, his outward motions belying the frantic calculations happening in his mind. He had to appear normal, to give Robert no reason to suspect that his entire plan had been discovered. As he worked, he became an observer, a spy in his own life. He watched the way Robert locked the cash box, the time Susan usually left to buy groceries, the patterns of their dull, predictable lives. His mind raced, searching for a weakness, an opening. A plan began to form, not a detailed one, but a desperate outline. He knew the main roads were too dangerous, he would be too visible. But he remembered the stories his father used to tell, stories of the old, decommissioned Chesapeake and Ohio railway lines that snaked through the Appalachian forest, forgotten paths that led away from the town and into the wilderness. His resources were pitifully small, but they were his. Tucked into a small tear in his basement mattress was a folded $20 bill, a collection of small tips from customers that he had painstakingly saved over months, hiding it from Robert's greedy eyes. That $20 was his entire fortune, a fragile shield against the world. Under his cot was the worn backpack that held his only true possessions, the 3 photographs, his father's cap, and a spare set of clothes. These were the tools of his escape. He knew he could not carry much, he would have to travel light and fast. The thought of food and water flickered in his mind, a problem he had no immediate solution for. The immense vulnerability of his situation was clear, but the alternative, the warehouse in Pittsburgh, was a fate so horrifying it eclipsed all other fears. As the evening wore on, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. This was not a game. This was a final, irreversible act. He was about to step off the edge of the known world into an abyss of uncertainty. Fear, cold and sharp, twisted in his stomach. He was just a boy, alone against the world. To steady himself, he closed his eyes and summoned the faces of his parents from the faded photographs. He pictured his father's strong, kind hands, the ones that had taught him how to read a railroad map. He pictured his mother's warm smile, the one that had always made him feel safe. He was not just running to save himself, he was running to protect the memory of their love. He was the last piece of them left in the world, and he would not let that legacy be extinguished in a dark, anonymous warehouse. The opportunity he was desperately waiting for arrived with the unexpected ring of the telephone in the house. Peter was finishing his last chore of the night, taking out the trash, when he overheard Susan's voice through the open kitchen window. Her tone was light, social. "Dinner at the Johnsons'? Oh, that sounds lovely. 7 o'clock? Yes, we can be there." The words struck him like a bolt of lightning. They were leaving. The house would be empty. A window of time, perhaps 2 or 3 hours, was about to open. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat counting down the minutes. He finished his work, his movements precise and calm, a mask of obedience hiding the storm of adrenaline and terror raging within him. This was his chance, his only chance, and it was happening tonight. He went down to the basement for the last time, the familiar damp chill of the air feeling different now, charged with a finality he could taste. The single bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows as he knelt by his cot and pulled out the backpack. His hands, usually stained with grease, were surprisingly steady as he packed. First, the photographs, carefully placed in an inner pocket. Then his father's cap, which he folded with a reverence that felt like a prayer. He retrieved the $20 bill from its hiding place and tucked it securely away. He added his only other shirt and a pair of socks. He zipped the bag, the sound echoing in the silence. For one terrifying second, he froze, a wave of doubt washing over him. Could he really do this? Then the image of the handwritten contract flashed in his mind, and the doubt was burned away by a surge of pure, desperate resolve. he moved through the house with the silent tread of a creature who knows its survival depends on not being seen. He listened at the top of the basement stairs until he heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of Robert's truck starting up and driving away. The house fell into a profound silence. He counted to 100, each number a small eternity, before he crept up the stairs. The house felt vast and empty, a hollow shell. He bypassed the creaky floorboard in the hallway, a piece of knowledge acquired through 2 years of servitude. The back door was his goal. His fingers fumbled with the latch, and the soft click it made as it opened seemed to echo like a gunshot. He slipped outside, the cool West Virginia night air hitting his face, a sudden, shocking sensation of freedom. Standing in the darkness of the backyard, Peter took one last look at the small house that had been his prison. It was just a building, a place of shadows and quiet misery. There was nothing left for him there. He turned his back on it, facing the deep, impenetrable blackness of the Appalachian forest that bordered the property. His plan was a ghost, a whisper of a memory about old train tracks. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one he had. He knew the general direction, a path his father had once pointed out on a long-ago walk. Taking a deep breath, he stepped off the manicured lawn and onto the bed of fallen leaves at the edge of the woods. The crunching sound under his feet was the first note in a new and terrifying song. He walked forward, melting into the shadows, not running from his past, but walking towards an unknown future. The first steps into the Appalachian forest were a plunge into a different world, a realm of absolute darkness and unfamiliar sounds. The manicured lawn of his prison was gone, replaced by the soft, damp earth and a thick carpet of last year's fallen leaves. Each crunch of his worn sneakers sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence, a declaration of his escape that he feared would echo all the way back to the house. The night air was cold and sharp, biting at his exposed skin and making him acutely aware of how thin his jacket was. He moved cautiously at first, his eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom, his hands held out in front of him to ward off unseen branches. He had no compass, no map, only a fragile memory of his father's voice explaining how the old decommissioned railroad lines were a secret map carved into the wilderness, a path that could lead a person away from everything they knew. He found the tracks after 10 minutes of stumbling through the undergrowth, 2 parallel lines of rust, barely visible under the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy. They were not a clear path, but a treacherous obstacle course. Many of the wooden ties had rotted away, leaving gaping holes that threatened to twist his ankle with every step. The steel rails themselves were slick with moss and dew, forcing him to walk on the uneven gravel bed between them. His progress was slow, agonizingly so. A distant dog began to bark, a frantic, angry sound that carried on the still night air, and Peter froze instantly, his heart leaping into his throat. He crouched low behind a thicket of ferns, every muscle tensed, convinced that Robert had already discovered his absence and sent a search party. He waited motionless until the barking subsided into a low growl and then silence before daring to move again. As he ventured deeper, the forest seemed to come alive around him, a living entity that watched his every move. The sounds were no longer just the wind or his own footsteps, but a symphony of unseen life. An owl hooted from a high branch, a mournful call that seemed to ask what a small boy was doing in its domain. Something rustled in the bushes to his right, a quick, furtive sound that made him jump and quicken his pace. He pulled his father's old railway cap down lower over his ears, a small, instinctual gesture of seeking comfort and protection. The fabric, worn soft with time, was a tangible link to a life when he was not alone, when the darkness held no terror. He focused on the feeling of the cap, on the memory of his father's hand on his shoulder, using it as a shield against the rising tide of fear that threatened to overwhelm him. After what felt like an hour of walking, the sound of rushing water grew louder, and the tracks ended abruptly at the edge of a deep, shadowy ravine. A creek, swollen with recent rain, churned below. The old wooden trestle that once spanned the gap was long gone, with only a few splintered pylons jutting out from the opposite bank like broken teeth. There was no way forward. Panic began to set in, cold and sharp. Turning back was not an option, but the dense, thorny undergrowth on either side of the ravine looked impenetrable. He scanned the darkness, his eyes desperately searching for a solution. A short distance downstream, a massive oak tree had fallen, its trunk forming a natural, precarious bridge across the churning water. It was his only way across. A dangerous path that offered the only hope of continuing his journey away from Hinton. The log was wider than he expected, but slick with a thick layer of green moss that was like ice under the soles of his shoes. He got down on his hands and knees, distributing his weight as evenly as he could, and began to crawl. The roar of the water below was deafening, filling his ears and making his head spin. He kept his eyes fixed on the other side, not daring to look down. Halfway across, his hand slipped. His body lurched sideways. The backpack shifted, throwing him off balance. For one terrifying moment, he was suspended over the void, his legs dangling in the air. He cried out, a small choked sound swallowed by the noise of the creek. With a desperate surge of strength, he clawed at the rough bark, his fingers finding a hold. He managed to pull himself back onto the log, his body trembling uncontrollably, and scrambled the rest of the way to the safety of the other bank. He lay on the damp ground for several minutes, his chest heaving, the cold from his soaked jeans seeping into his bones. The adrenaline that had propelled him this far was beginning to fade, leaving behind a profound and bone-deep exhaustion. Every muscle ached. The $20 bill in his pocket felt impossibly flimsy, a useless piece of paper against the vast, uncaring wilderness. A wave of despair washed over him. He was cold, wet, and utterly alone. For a fleeting moment, the thought of the basement, with its single lumpy cot and thin blanket, seemed almost comforting in its familiarity. But then the image of the crumpled contract flashed in his mind, the cold, transactional words that valued his life at $400 a month. The memory was a splash of icy water, extinguishing the temptation to surrender and forcing him back to his feet. He had been walking for hours, pushing his small body to its limit. The moon, his only source of light, was now obscured by a thick bank of clouds, plunging the forest into an even deeper level of darkness. The railroad tracks, which had been his one constant guide, now seemed to mock him, stretching endlessly into the blackness with no sign of change, no landmark to indicate how far he had come. He was just a boy, following a path to nowhere. He stopped, leaning against a towering pine tree to catch his breath, and listened. There was nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing and the whisper of the wind. He tried to recall the old railroad maps his father had shown him, but in the disorienting darkness, the lines and names were a meaningless jumble in his memory. The sheer scale of his vulnerability settled upon him. He was a single tiny point of life in a vast and indifferent landscape. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the night. It was not the sound of the forest. It was a low, mechanical rumble that grew steadily louder, the distinct noise of a large truck laboring up a distant incline. He immediately dove off the tracks, scrambling behind a dense wall of rhododendron bushes, his heart pounding in his chest. He pressed his face into the dirt, trying to make himself invisible. Was it Robert? Had he somehow figured out which way he had gone? He imagined headlights cutting through the trees, a beam of light finding his hiding place. The sound grew to a crescendo and then, just as quickly, began to fade as the truck crested the hill and continued on its way. It was just a random vehicle on a remote mountain highway, a ghost passing in the night. The relief was immense, but the encounter left him drained and more terrified than before. The terrain began to change, the relatively flat path giving way to a steep upward grade. The railroad bed became a treacherous slope of loose gravel and shifting earth. With each step forward, his feet slid half a step back, stealing his precious energy. The climb was relentless. He was forced to use his hands, grabbing onto exposed roots and rocks to pull himself upward, his fingers raw and scraped. The backpack felt like it was filled with stones, its straps digging painfully into his shoulders. His lungs burned and a metallic taste filled his mouth. This was no longer just walking. It was a desperate vertical struggle against gravity and exhaustion. The world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of him, the single-minded focus of placing one foot in front of the other, of gaining just one more inch of elevation. Near the top of the grueling climb, his foot caught on something hard and unyielding, sending him sprawling forward onto the gravel. It wasn't a rock or a root. He pushed himself up and felt around in the darkness, his fingers closing on a piece of cold, twisted metal. It was a section of rail, bent into a grotesque shape and half buried in the hillside. He looked around and saw more debris, splintered wood, shards of metal, the skeletal remains of a railroad car's undercarriage. He had walked directly into the overgrown scar of an old landslide, a place where a train had met its end decades ago. The tracks did not continue over the crest of the hill. They simply stopped, consumed by the earth. His path, his only guide through the wilderness, had vanished completely. A profound sense of hopelessness settled over him, heavier than the backpack, colder than his wet clothes. He had come all this way only to be met with a dead end. He was lost, exhausted, and his desperate plan had failed. He sank to the ground, the fight finally draining out of him, and pulled his knees to his chest, a small, defeated figure in the immense darkness. The forest was no longer a path to freedom, but an impassable wall. As he sat there, shivering and ready to give up, his eyes, now fully accustomed to the deep gloom, caught something. A shape. Amid the chaotic jumble of rocks and earth from the landslide, there was a straight, unnatural line. It was the top edge of something rectangular, something man-made, almost entirely swallowed by the hillside. A flicker of curiosity, the last ember of his resolve, stirred within him. Driven by a primal curiosity that momentarily eclipsed his exhaustion, Peter crawled toward the unnatural shape half buried in the hillside. He began to dig with his bare hands, the cold, damp earth packing under his fingernails. He clawed away layers of soil, roots, and decaying leaves, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His fingers soon scraped against something hard, flat, and cold. It was not rock. It was metal, coated in a thick layer of rust that flaked away under his frantic efforts. He dug wider, faster, uncovering more of the surface. A rivet, a long, straight seam, the curved edge of what could only be a window frame. The realization dawned on him with a jolt of disbelief. It was the side of a passenger train car, a steel behemoth swallowed whole by the earth in a forgotten cataclysm. This was not just a dead end. It was a tomb, a shelter, a secret hiding place built by the indifferent forces of nature. He scrambled along the exposed length of the car, his hands searching for any kind of opening. The doors were either completely buried or rusted shut, fused to their frames by decades of moisture and pressure. Defeat began to creep back in, the shelter so close yet so inaccessible. But then his hand brushed against a jagged edge of metal near the base of the car. It was a small maintenance hatch, or perhaps a window that had long ago rusted away from its frame, leaving a dark, irregular opening no larger than a school backpack. It was a dangerous, uninviting hole, its edges sharp and menacing. But it was a way in. With no other choice, he pushed his backpack through first, then sucked in his breath and carefully, painfully, squeezed his small body through the opening. Tumbling into a pocket of absolute darkness and a silence that had not been broken for over 70 years. Once inside, he lay on the floor for a long moment, his body screaming with exhaustion, but his mind registering a new and profound sensation: safety. The suffocating sounds of the forest, the wind, the rustling creatures, the distant rumble of the highway were gone, replaced by a thick, muffled stillness. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of ancient dust, decaying paper, and the faint phantom smell of old wood polish. He was completely hidden, entombed in a steel shell deep within the Appalachian mountainside. No one in the world knew where he was. Robert Davis could search for a lifetime and never find this place. For the first time in 2 years, the constant, low-level hum of fear in his mind began to subside. This place, this forgotten relic of a bygone era, was a sanctuary, a haven from a world that had become his predator. His eyes, however, could see nothing in the pitch-black interior. He needed light. Fumbling in the darkness, he retrieved his backpack and felt for its contents, knowing he had no flashlight. As he sat up, his hand brushed against a cold metallic object on the floor near where he had entered. He felt its shape, a wire handle, a glass front, a wide base. It was a railroad lantern, heavy and solid. He shook it gently and heard a faint slosh of liquid inside. Kerosene. A desperate hope surged through him. He felt around the floor near the lantern, and his fingers closed over a small, rectangular tin box. He pried it open. Inside, nestled in dry cotton, was a small book of matches. With trembling hands, he struck one. It flared to life, a tiny star in the immense darkness. He carefully lifted the lantern's glass chimney and touched the flame to the wick. The lantern's flame sputtered at first, then caught, growing into a steady, warm glow that pushed back the suffocating darkness. The light washed over the interior of the car, and Peter gasped. This was no empty, rusted-out shell. It was a time capsule, a world perfectly preserved. The velvet seats, though covered in a thick layer of dust, were still intact, their deep green color muted but visible. On small brass hooks along the wall, old Chesapeake and Ohio Railway uniforms hung as if their owners had just stepped away for a moment. A conductor's hat sat on a small table, and signal flags were neatly folded in a wooden rack. On a large corkboard, old route maps were tacked up, their lines tracing paths through a version of America that no longer existed. He was not in a tomb. He was in a ghost's office, a silent, waiting world frozen in 1952. As his eyes adjusted to the warm, flickering light, they were drawn to one particular object that seemed both perfectly placed and strangely personal. Tucked away under the long velvet bench that ran along one side of the car was a handsome leather briefcase. It was dark brown, its surface cracked with age, but clearly made of high-quality material. The two brass latches on the front were tarnished to a dull bronze, but they were not broken. Unlike the railroad equipment, which felt like part of a job, the briefcase felt like a possession, something cherished and deliberately stored away. It seemed to hum with a silent energy, a focal point of untold history in this forgotten space. It called to him, a silent invitation to uncover the secret of this place and the people who had last been here. He approached the briefcase with a sense of reverence, his footsteps soft on the dusty floor. He knelt before it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. A wave of hesitation washed over him. To open it felt like a violation, like reading a stranger's diary or intruding on a private memory. This car was someone else's story, and he was an uninvited guest. But the need to know, to understand, was overwhelming. His entire life had been defined by secrets kept from him, the truth of his parents' pension, the contract for his sale. He was tired of being on the outside of his own story. This briefcase, he felt with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, held an answer. Not necessarily an answer for him, but an answer that mattered, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known he was trying to solve. And so Peter arrived at the moment that began this story, the moment his desperate escape transformed into a profound discovery. He pulled the briefcase from under the bench and settled it in his lap, the old leather cool against his legs. The flickering light of the kerosene lantern danced across its worn surface. With fingers that trembled not from cold, but from anticipation, he worked the tarnished brass latches. They resisted for a moment, then clicked open with a soft, metallic sound that seemed deafening in the absolute silence of the car. He took a deep breath, the dusty air filling his lungs, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, bathed in the warm glow of the lantern, lay a stack of yellowed papers, what looked like engineering schematics, and resting on top of them all was a single sealed envelope, its paper turned to a delicate shade of ivory by the passage of time. He gently lifted the envelope from its resting place. It was addressed in a beautiful, looping cursive script that was as much a work of art as it was writing. The ink had faded from black to a soft brown, but the words were still perfectly clear. It read, "For my son, Henry Sellers, on his 11th birthday." A strange pang of recognition went through him. His own 11th birthday had passed just 2 months prior, a non-event marked only by another long day of work at the auto repair shop. He felt an immediate, inexplicable kinship with this boy, Henry, who had lived a lifetime ago. He turned the envelope over in his hands, the paper fragile as a dried leaf. Taking one last look at the silent, watching railroad car around him, he carefully broke the 70-year-old seal and unfolded the letter within, ready to read the words that would unlock the heart of this hidden sanctuary. The flickering lantern light cast a warm, dancing glow on the ivory-colored paper as Peter began to read. The letter was dated October 12th, 1952. The handwriting was a strong, confident cursive, the kind of script he had only seen in old books, each letter formed with care and precision. The letter began simply, "My dearest Henry," and the words seemed to lift off the page, carrying with them the weight of 7 decades of silence. Peter held his breath, feeling like an intruder in a sacred moment, a ghost listening to a conversation from a world long since past. The paper was impossibly fragile in his hands, a delicate membrane separating the present from a past that felt more real and alive than his own life. He was not just reading words, he was touching a moment of profound paternal love, preserved like an insect in amber, waiting for the light to reveal its perfect, intricate form. The letter was from a man named Walter Sellers to his son Henry on his 11th birthday. In his elegant script, Walter explained that this very railcar, car 734 of the Chesapeake and Ohio line, was now Henry's alone. It had been part of the consist that had derailed in the great landslide of that spring, and while the other cars were salvaged for scrap, Walter, a railroad foreman, had pulled strings to have this one left where it lay, hidden and protected by the very earth that had claimed it. He called it Henry's Secret Engineer's Office, a private kingdom where his son could study the maps, read the engineering manuals, and dream of all the railroads he would one day build or command. It was not an accident or a ruin. It was a deliberate gift, a sanctuary built from a disaster, a testament to a father's desire to nurture his son's greatest passion. Walter went on to describe the items he and Henry's mother, Cecilia, had left for him. The briefcase contained not just the letter, but also a set of professional drafting tools, a slide rule, and several books on locomotive engineering and bridge construction. He explained that the signal flags in the rack were real, retired from service, and that the uniforms hanging on the hooks were his own from when he first started on the line. These were not toys, Walter wrote, but the first tools of a future profession. He encouraged Henry to use them, to learn from them, to fill the quiet space with the noise of his imagination. Every sentence was imbued with a deep, unwavering belief in his son's potential, a stark and painful contrast to the way Robert Davis saw Peter, only as a source of cheap labor, a body to be used until it could be sold. A section of the letter was written in a different hand, a softer, more rounded cursive. It was from Cecilia. She wrote that she wanted this place to be more than an office. She wanted it to be a refuge, a place where, if the world ever felt too loud or too unkind, Henry could come to be alone with his thoughts and his dreams. She spoke of the importance of having a space that belonged only to you, a place where you could be your truest self without judgment or expectation. To Peter, who had never had a space of his own, whose only private area was a cold corner of a basement, the idea was revolutionary. A parent's job, Cecilia wrote, was not just to provide food and shelter, but to build a safe harbor for a child's soul to grow. The words were a gentle balm on a wound Peter didn't even know he had. The final paragraph brought the voices of both parents together. They spoke of their immense pride in him, not for any accomplishment but simply for who he was, their curious, intelligent, kind-hearted son. They didn't write "we love you" in a simple phrase. They demonstrated it through every action, every carefully chosen object, every word of encouragement written on that page. Their love was an act of construction, as solid and real as the steel car itself. It was a promise that no matter where the tracks of life took him, he would always have this foundation, this starting point built of their unwavering affection and belief. The letter ended with the simple, powerful sign-off. "With all the love in our hearts, Dad, Walter, and Mom, Cecilia." Peter read the closing line 3 times, the words blurring as his eyes filled with tears. The concepts laid out in the letter were so foreign to Peter that they felt like they were written in a different language. Pride, encouragement, unconditional love, a safe harbor. These were not words that had ever been used in relation to him. His existence had been transactional, his worth measured in completed chores and his future valued at $400 a month. The Davis family had provided a roof, but they had never built a home, let alone a sanctuary. He looked at the careful cursive, the thoughtful words, and saw the ghost of a childhood he couldn't even imagine, a world where parents saw their children not as burdens or assets, but as precious dreams to be nurtured and protected. The letter was a window into another universe, and the light pouring through it was both beautiful and blindingly painful, and that is when the cry from the beginning of our story finally escaped him. It was not a loud, wailing grief, but a silent, profound collapse. His small shoulders shook in the cold air of the railcar, the lantern light casting a long, trembling shadow on the wall. The tears that streamed down his face were not for his own parents, whom he missed with a constant dull ache. They were for this, for the raw, overwhelming evidence of a parental love so pure and so powerful that he had never known it could exist. He wept for the beauty of what the Sellers family had built, and he wept for the terrible, empty void in his own life where that kind of love should have been. It was the grief of a starving person being shown a magnificent feast they could see and smell, but never, ever touch. He slowly lifted his head, his tear-streaked face illuminated by the lantern. He looked around the car, but he no longer saw a dusty, forgotten relic. He saw a cathedral, a monument built by love. The old conductor's hat on the table was a crown. The hanging uniforms were vestments. The engineering books were sacred texts. Every single object had been placed with intention, with care, with a deep and abiding affection for the boy who would find them. This was not just a shelter from the forest, it was a shelter from the world. It was a physical manifestation of a promise from a parent to a child. You are safe here. You are valued here. Your dreams matter here. Peter reached out a trembling hand and touched the dusty green velvet of the seat, as if he could absorb the warmth of the love that had been poured into this space. He reached back into the briefcase and pulled out one of the heavy books. It was a detailed manual on the inner workings of a C&O Class H8 Allegheny steam locomotive, filled with complex diagrams and technical specifications. Tucked inside the front cover was a small handwritten note. "Henry, when you understand this, you'll be able to build anything. I know you can do it. Dad." It was another small, perfect piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just a hideout. It was a school. It was a curriculum designed by a father to pass on his knowledge and his passion. It was a legacy of empowerment, a set of tools given to a child so he could build his own future. The contrast was a physical blow. Robert Davis had given him tools too, a broom, a scrub brush, a wrench, not to build his future but to service Robert's present. The $400. The number echoed in his mind, ugly and profane in this sacred space. His entire being, his past, present, and future, had been reduced to a monthly payment, and here, in this car, was a gift that was truly priceless, an offering that could never be quantified in monetary terms. The Sellers family had invested their time, their effort, and their hearts to create something for their son. The Davis family had invested nothing and were preparing to liquidate him for a profit. The two opposing forces of the world, creation born from love and destruction born from greed, had never been clearer to him. He was caught between them, a refugee from one, now standing in a museum dedicated to the other. He felt a deep and sudden connection to Henry Sellers, the boy who had received this incredible gift. He was not jealous of him. He was grateful to him. He was grateful that Henry had existed, that he had inspired such love, and that his parents had chosen to express it in such a lasting, tangible way. By building this sanctuary for their son, the Sellers family had, 70 years later, inadvertently saved another. They had left behind more than just a railcar and some books. They had left behind proof. They had left evidence that a different way of living, a different way of caring for a child, was possible. This proof was a weapon, a shield that Peter could now use against the crushing worthlessness that had been his constant companion for the past 2 years. As the last of his tears subsided, a profound calm settled over him. The exhaustion was still there, a heavy weight in his bones, but it was now overlaid with something new, a sense of purpose. He was no longer just a boy running from a terrible fate. He was the caretaker of this story, the sole witness to this forgotten act of love. The knowledge contained in that letter had fundamentally rewired his understanding of the world and his place in it. He now knew, with an unshakable certainty, that he was not the problem. The neglect and cruelty he had endured were not a reflection of his own worth, but of the profound failings of the people who were supposed to protect him. He was not an asset to be sold. He was a boy who, like Henry Sellers, deserved a sanctuary for his dreams, and for the first time he believed he might one day find it. After 4 days of hiding in the silent, dusty railcar, subsisting on the last of his meager supplies, Peter was discovered. He was found not by a search party, but by a kind-faced 72-year-old man with eyes that seemed to hold a deep and familiar knowledge of the forest. It was Henry Sellers himself, now a retired railroad historian, making a nostalgic pilgrimage to the secret sanctuary of his youth. Seeing the small, frightened boy huddled by the lantern, clutching his father's letter, Henry did not react with alarm or anger, but with a quiet, profound understanding. He listened to Peter's fragmented story, and within the hour, he had guided the boy out of the woods and into the care of a trusted lawyer. That single act of compassion set in motion the wheels of a justice that Peter had never believed was possible, a process that would finally bring the crimes of Robert Davis into the light. The legal fallout was swift and decisive, with Henry Sellers advocating for him and the crumpled contract as undeniable evidence. An investigation by Child Protective Services uncovered the full extent of the abuse. Robert and Susan Davis were arrested, their carefully constructed facade of benevolence crumbling under the weight of their crimes. They faced charges of felony embezzlement for stealing Peter's pension, severe child labor exploitation, and the attempted trafficking of a minor. They lost their guardianship, were forced by the court to repay every cent of the stolen money into a trust for Peter, and were ultimately sentenced to prison. In their place, Henry and his wife Martha, who had tragically lost their own son years before, stepped forward. They saw in Peter not a replacement, but a kindred spirit who needed the sanctuary they had always known how to provide. They formally adopted him, giving him not just a home, but the family he had lost. The railcar, the steel shell that had been both a tomb and a cradle, was not abandoned. With Henry's engineering knowledge and Peter's newfound purpose, they carefully excavated and restored it. It was a slow, deliberate process of healing for them both. They cleaned away the dust of 70 years, polished the brass fittings, and preserved the precious contents. The car was transformed from a private memory into a public monument. It became the Henry Sellers Railcar Museum, a small but powerful testament to railroad history, and, more importantly, a center for child advocacy. The letter from Walter and Cecilia was framed and placed at its heart, a permanent reminder that a parent's love, expressed with intention and care, could create a legacy of protection that echoed through generations, a beacon of hope for those lost in the dark. 4 years later, at the age of 15, Peter Miller is no longer the silent, invisible boy from the basement. He is an award-winning student at a top-ranked technical high school. His passion for transportation engineering, a living tribute to both his biological father and the man who became his new one. He is the author of a successful children's book detailing the history of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, its proceeds funding the museum's mission. He stands confidently inside the restored railcar, giving tours and sharing his story, his voice clear and strong. The museum he helps run, fueled by his story and the legacy of the Sellers family, has already provided the resources to identify and rescue 18 other children from situations of labor exploitation in the region. The old, forgotten tracks, once a desperate path of escape, had ultimately led him to his true destination, a future he was now building